Good evening and welcome back. If you've been following along in our previous tutorial, we've just went over how to do the UVs and the texture map for our really simple guy here. And in this tutorial, we're going to look at how to set up the skeletal system, or the joints and all that for the character. So, before we get started, just to let you know, this is a beginner's tutorial, so if you're experienced with doing 3D animation, then you're probably familiar with joints or bones and that sort of thing. So if that's the case, it's probably not for you, but if you are a beginner and you want to learn how to do this at a very basic level, this is a good place to start. And without further ado, let's get started. So I have my character selected. You do want to be in object mode. Make sure your character is selected in object mode. Just because joints don't like to be selected in component mode. And then we're going to go up to our shelf here, make sure we're in rigging. And also bring up your editing mode here, change that to rigging as well. Now if you did not watch the video primer on joints, go ahead and do that before you get involved with this. That way you're familiar with joints and how to place them, how to create them and set them up. Okay, so with my joint tool selected, I'm going to go ahead and take a front view. Remember, we don't want to put joints in a perspective view just because we don't know where they're being placed. Okay, so for the most part you want to do that in a orthographic view. Now you can place joints in perspective if you open up your joint options here. So I'm going to go to the make sure you have your joint creation tool selected, and then over in the tool palette, if you open that up, you can check this little box here that says projected centered. What that'll do is if you click on your model, it will try to project and place that joint center of the model, which is handy if you want to place these in a perspective view. I generally don't use this particular feature unless I'm doing fingers or whatnot. And in this particular case, I'm not going to use this feature since we're on a beginner tutorial, but I just wanted to show you that it is possible. But I'm going to uncheck that. I will delete that joint, and I will go ahead into my front view. So front view and side view are going to be your friend for most of this stuff. So front view, and I will press 6 brings up my color, but I do want to see my background, so I'm going to, I do want to see my grid line, so I will press 4 to go back into wireframe, and I'll center this up. Now before we get started placing the joints, just want to make sure that the model here is touching the grid. Okay, make sure that his feet are on the grid line. If he's not, you're going to want to lower him down. I'll show you how to do that. Press W, bring up your move tool, and if your character is kind of floating up here, just make sure that your widget is snapped to his feet. If it's not, go ahead and press the D key. That's going to change your widget to this configuration here, so we can move the widget itself. And then just hold down the V key and drag the up arrow, and if you hover your mouse near a vertex, it'll snap that widget on the vertex. I'm going to actually snap it down to the bottom vertex there, and then I'm going to press the D key again. That'll turn my my widget mover off, and then I'm going to hold the X key and then bring that down to the center of the grid. And once I do that, I should be pretty good. If you have any values in here that are not zeroed out, just go ahead and make sure you do that. So go up to Edit. We're going to delete history. That'll clear our history here. And we also want to go to Modify and then Freeze Transforms. That's going to zero out your transforms here, and that way if your character ever moves off of 0, you can just type 0 back in and it should center him back up. And just make sure that's true on both the front view and the side view. You want to make sure you're good in center. Okay. Once that's good, we'll activate our joint placement tool. And then in our joint options, remember we can get to our joint options through this little hammer here. Make sure that your joint creation tool is selected. If you've looked at the joint primer, then you'll probably be familiar with these settings. Make sure that our bone radius settings are good. I'm going to do, given the size of my character, I'm going to do a bone radius, short bone radius of 1 and a long bone radius of 1. That way my bones are a decent size in him. Okay. And then for my orientation settings, I actually want to orient this with my primary axis going down the x-axis. And then, depending on the studio you work with and what rotation order you're going to be dealing with, you can kind of set this up however you like. But from my experience, either Y forward or Z forward for your bone, I find you get your best rotations out of having Z forward. So I'm going to actually have my secondary axis set to Z, and then I'm going to align my secondary axis. So go ahead and select that. I'm going to align that to the positive direction. And what that'll do is when I drop my joint in here, what that'll do is it'll make it so that your x-axis, of course, is pointing down the length of the joint, and your z-axis is forward, and y will be to the left of z. There is a rotation order. I'm not going to get too far into rotation order in this tutorial, but basically rotation order has to deal with which one of these axes has priority. And if you rotate one axis, that axis will change, and some axes will stay the same. And you want to avoid what's called gimbal lock. Gimbal lock is where this little rotating handle, these are gimbals, okay? And you can actually rotate this in a manner where these things will overlap, and when they overlap, they can get stuck. So setting up a rotation order that tries to avoid that is the best way of going. I find that having Z forward gives you a good result with that. However, I haven't had any issues with Y forward in quite a while, so but I think this is the standard right now. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that. I'll go back into my front view, and now that we have our joint system set, let's go ahead and start placing our joints. I'm going to get my first joint right here in the middle of the body, and then I'm going to do the next couple joints. This one's going to be right here. It's going to be spine 1, spine 2, I'll do spine 3, I'm going to do neck, I'll do head, and then I'll do my final head joint. I'll hit enter, that'll set that. And what I want to do is I want to make sure all these are right in the middle. So I'm going to grab this first joint, bring up the move tool, and I made it so that I could see my center axis. I made my center axis red so it's easy to see. So under display, grid options, my main axis, I just changed it to red. You can change whatever color you like, but I find a bright color is easier to see. And I'm going to hold down the X key, and I'm just going to drag that joint right to the center, make sure it snaps in. It's important that these are centrally aligned. That way, when you try to mirror them later, you don't have anything that's off center. So go ahead and make sure that's center. And remember that joints are on a parent-child hierarchy, so if I move a parent joint, I will move the children. Okay? Just be aware of that as you're moving these. Because if you move a child joint and then move the parent, you'll have some issues. You want to do parent first, and then the child. If you need to move a joint by itself, you can do that. All you have to do is select the joint, and then press the D key, and it will allow the joint to move independently of the parent. See that? So I'm not, this joint is not messing with the child, and it's also not moving the entire chain. And I'll grab that last joint up there and make that snap as well. Once I have those centrally aligned, I'm going to go back down. I'm going to name these. So the first one here, this is pelvis. Next one, it's going to be spine 1. And then all you have to do is press the arrow keys up or down to move up or down the chain. So in this case, I'm now on spine 2. and then spine 3. Now we don't need to approximate every bone in the human body. We just need something to give a general movement. Okay. This one's going to be neck. This one is either, this is up to you. You could do neck 2, or you could do head 1. I generally do this one at the jawline as a head joint, so I just call that head 1. And then the last one is head 2. I'll go ahead and start doing my leg joints. So I'm going to come down here and bring my joint tool, and I want to set my leg joints in the center of the mass. And every time you place joints, you want to make sure they are center mass of the mesh. Okay, you don't want to have a situation where they curve in a weird way, and the leg joints are especially. So I'm going to try to find the most central location for this joint. It's probably going to be about here. And then I'm going to go down through the knee here. And I really want this to be straight. I'm going to come down to the foot. I'm going to do that as well. I'm going to hit enter. I'm going to move this off just so I can make sure that these are straight. You can see on this grid line that they do curve. So I'm going to hold down the X key. I'm going to snap that one to there. Select this one, hold down X, snap that straight. This one, hold X, snap it straight. Now it's important, again, that your leg joints are straight. And the reason for that has to do with setting up an IK rig. If I take this guy right here, so you have your joint tool, right next to it, this is an IK tool. If I select that, and then I click here, and then there, I create an IK handle. Now you don't have to do this step, but I'm just going to show you what happens. So if I try to move this IK, you see how nothing happens, right? IKs need a bend in the joint chain in order for it to be influenced. But what you don't want is you don't want the leg to bend weird. So let me go ahead and undo that. And let's say this was bent this way, okay? So this is the front of the knee, and if I try to set up an IK here to there, and I bend it, now it bends, but my knee's breaking. My knee shouldn't bend sideways, okay? The knee should bend forward. So what we do is we make sure that the front of the leg is straight, and then we bend it on the side. So I'm going to go ahead and undo. Make sure that this is straight. So I'll hold X, I'll snap it straight. I'm going to move this into the leg center mass. I'm going to go ahead and go to the side view. And in my side view, I'm going to bend the knee. So I'm going to take this knee joint, but I don't want to move the foot joint, because if I do this, I move the foot. So I'm going to press the D key. It's going to make this little circle here. That's going to give me a access to move the joint by itself. Go ahead and move that forward so it's center of the knee. So now I have a natural bend in the knee. And if I were to add an IK handle, so hip to ankle, now the knee bends forward. And that's the kind of movement we would like to have if we were to set up an IK. So I'm going to Control Z. I'm not going to put an IK handle in this today because we're just doing a simple joint chain. But if you wanted to do it later on, now you would have the appropriate alignment to get an IK working. So back in the front view, there's one other thing. You can see that our joint chain moves through the leg, but it doesn't move centrally through the leg very well. It actually kind of moves at an angle because the way the meat of the mesh is. You can do a few things. You can try moving the mesh. So if I grab these vertices, for example, I can move the mesh around and center that up, or I can do a rotation on the joint. Now it's important that when you first place your joints that you try to avoid rotating them, because IKs don't work off of rotation. They'll actually yell at you if you try to insert a IK handle and a rotation is on the joint. So these always have to be at a 0 value. It's also good for the animator that they have a place to go back to. For example, if this had some number in it, like 3.5 or whatever, the animator would have to remember that number as the default position. And we don't want that to be the situation. We always want them to be able to hit 0 and put the mesh back to default position. So you don't want to have any rotations in here when you create this stuff. But there is a way to rotate this and then set these back to 0. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this, bring up my rotation, and I'm going to rotate this just a little bit so it aligns with the path of my mesh here. Center that up, and now that follows my knee a little nicer. But you can see I have this rotation here, right? And I don't want that there, and I can't zero it out because I need that value, because if I zero it, it moves back. So how do I do it? Well, if I open up the attributes of the joint, you can see we have the translation, rotation, and scale, and we also have the rotate axis. The rotate axis shows it at 0, 0, 0. So if I type in 0, it's going to go back to 0. Well, if I copy this value here, and then I go down to my rotate value, and I paste that in, you can see over here that my leg moved. I'm going to go up to where I have the default, or my rotation value up here. I'm going to put that into 0. So now we've created an offset. So whenever we type 0, this is what it's going to go to. And the animator will be happy, and the joint will stay in position. What I was mentioning earlier, though, about rotation order is right here. If you needed to change rotation order for any reason, you can do that here. Default rotation order is X, Y, Z, and that should be fine for what we're doing here. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but just be aware that you can change the rotation order if you needed to. Okay, so with my leg created, I'm going to go back to my channel box. We're going to name these joints. So the first joint here, that's going to be my hip. And I'm just going to do L underscore hip. And you'll find different naming conventions out there, but this is one that I've used for just about ever. And it depends on what studio you're working in. I'm going to do L underscore knee. And you might be wondering, why am I saying L? Well, that's for the left side, because this is the left side of the character. Last joint in the chain, this is going to be L underscore foot. And now it's time to make the other leg, but we are 3D modelers. We're kind of lazy. We don't ever do things twice. So what I'm going to do is, instead of making this again and trying to fiddle with it and get it into position, I can actually mirror this. So I'm going to go up to skeleton, make sure we're in rigging here. Under skeleton, I can come down to mirror joints, open up the options box. Now we have mirror across, and what this does is it determines based on which way your character's facing, really. So my character's facing down the Z, and Y is my up. So I'm in the YZ plane here. So I'm going to choose YZ. If your character was facing a different direction, then you would pick a different orientation here. Mirror function, you have behavior and orientation. It really comes down to preference. I prefer behavior over orientation, and I'll show you more about that in just a second. And then search for, so we have a prefix L underscore because we have left, and then we're going to change it to R underscore, and that's going to make the leg and rename it for us. So I hit apply. There's our new leg, and you can see we have right hip, right knee, and right foot. So again, what I was saying about orientation and the function, so this knee, if I grab that, I'm going to go into a perspective view here. So this knee, if I were to rotate this, let's see, 90 degrees, you can see how that kind of pops out this way. And if I grab that one and I rotate 90 degrees, it pops out that way. And both of these are positive values. So positive gives me this result, so I should expect positive to give me that result. But if I had done it under orientation, then this would have to be a negative 90 to go that way. and the positive would actually go the same direction. So it really just comes down to preference. I prefer positive numbers giving me a predictable result over the other. So I'm going to set those back to 0, and that one back to 0. Okay, so I have my legs in. I can go ahead and close this mirror box for now. I'm going to select my hip, and I want to connect it to this pelvis joint. I'm going to a front view so you can see. So I'm going to connect it to this pelvis joint by holding Shift and then selecting the pelvis. I'm going to press the P key, and that's going to parent it. So remember that our root here is the parent and that our leg is the child. So the arrow should point to the leg. I'm going to select the other leg, hold down Shift, select the pelvis, and then press the P key. And now I should have an arrow going this way and an arrow going that way. And that's our skeleton through our legs. I'm going to come up to do my shoulder next. So grab our joint tool. First joint is going to be our collarbone joint, so right around, that's good enough. And then from the collarbone, I'm going to do the shoulder. And from my shoulder, I'm going to do my elbow. And then from my elbow, I'm going to do my wrist. Okay. Now the arm is kind of the same way as the knee. You want to make sure that it only bends in the plane that it's supposed to bend in. So you can see that my arm kind of bends this way because that's where my elbow is. So this is okay. But if this was straight, then you would make the chain straight and only bend it where you need it. So in my case, my arm is straight this way. So this way should be straight. But my arm bends this way. So having a natural bend here is okay. I'm going to press Enter. And now I'm going to name this. So this is going to be left clavicle, L_clavicle, C-L-A-V-I-C-L-E. That's your collarbone. You could say left collar if you wanted to. Next joint on the list, this is going to be left shoulder. Then I go down the chain, left elbow. And then left wrist. Just to make a note, because I didn't mention it a second ago, as you're placing the joints, you may notice that I'm placing the joints near the edges of the mesh. Okay, because these are the areas, these edge loops are where the mesh will bend. So the elbow will bend here on this loop. If I were to put this joint in the middle where there is no loop, it won't bend there. So try to keep that in mind as you're placing these, so that you know if you want it to bend at the shoulder, it should be where the shoulder connects. If you want it to bend at the elbow, it should be where the elbow connects, and so on. Same thing with the knee. So down here on my knee, my hip is placed where the hip connects, my knee is placed where the knee is, and my foot, and so forth. Once again, we're going to duplicate this, so go ahead and open up your skeleton and then mirror joints, and then click, make sure your settings are good. So YZ, I'm doing behavior, changing L to R, and then I'll hit apply. So there's my other half. And now I'll just parent these. So I'm going to select my shoulder, and I'm going to choose spine 3. Spine 3 is this one right here. Okay? Because that's the top of my spine. So shoulder, or sorry, clavicle to spine 3, and then the P key. And then right clavicle to spine 3, and then P. And there we go. So I have that connected. So there is our skeleton. But we're not quite out of the woods yet. We want to make sure that our joints are oriented correctly. And earlier I mentioned rotation order, and I'm not going to go too much into that, but you do want to have your joints all oriented the same direction. That way you can predict the way they're going to bend. Now, it depends on your convention. Some folks will actually orient their joints, like they'll orient the spine one way, and they'll do the arm a different way, and they'll do the leg a different way. Again, it depends on your studio. The whole point is to try to avoid gimbal lock and have a predictable skeleton. But we're going to just do a very simple orientation, make sure that they're all rotating on the correct plane. And, oh, one thing I want to check before that. I just want to make sure my spine has a bit of a curve to it, just because you can see my spine is straight. And if you were to put an IK in here, the spine wouldn't bend. So I'm going to put a natural bend in the spine. Let's grab this joint. I'm going to press the D key so it doesn't move the children. Because if I don't, it moves the whole thing, right? I just want to move the joint, so D. I forgot to do this earlier, so just go ahead and move this one just slightly off center in the side view. That way we have a curve. I'm going to do the same thing to this one. Spine 2. Spine 3 is good. I just want to have a bit of a curve between those. Let's see how. That's probably fine. So just a little bit of a natural curve. That way if I put an IK in there, once again if I were to do this, grab that IK handle. This is really the wrong direction, but if I were to move that, right, I could bend it that way. If I didn't have that bend there, it wouldn't bend. I don't need the IK. I just wanted to show you that would work. Okay, so now that we have our skeleton, we are going to orient the joints. So before we can orient the joints, we want to make sure we select all the joints. And what you might be thinking is, well, I have it selected, but you really don't. You only have the pelvis selected, and I can prove that. Go ahead and open up under Window, go down to Outliner. Outliner will show you everything in your scene, including your skeletal hierarchy. You can see here we have the little joint symbol, and we have pelvis, because that's our root. If I hold Shift and click this plus sign, it'll open this up, and you can actually see all of your joints in the chain. I'll go ahead and expand that. So here are all the joints in our joint chain, and you can see I selected pelvis, and pelvis is the only one selected, even though they're all highlighted. Okay. The only way I can actually select a joint is by clicking on it. So you can see as I selected spine 1 that I have spine 1 selected. It shows that pelvis is grayed out because it's actually a parent of these, but I don't have pelvis selected. If I select pelvis and then I hold Shift and then select spine 1, you can see that I have both selected. If I hold Shift, hit spine 3, I have those, and so on and so on and so on. You can see that it's showing what I'm selecting. So if you click a joint, you're only selecting that one, but we need all of these selected to orient them. So I'm going to go ahead and hit pelvis. And if you hold Shift and go down to the bottom, you can select the whole thing. So that's one way of doing it. The other way, which is a little bit faster, is to use the selection tool. So I'm going to go up to Select, go down to All by Type, and you can choose Joint. Now this works if you have one skeleton. If you have multiple skeletons, it'll grab every skeleton. So this is only good if you have one character in your scene. And if you do that, it'll also select all of your joints. Okay. So with that done, I'm going to go ahead and close that. I'm going to open up skeleton, and I'm going to come down to orient joints. Make sure we get the options box. And as soon as we open this up, I'm going to come down to toggle local axis visibility. This is going to show me my local axes of all the joints. I'm going to go ahead and hit that. And you can see these little flags. All these little flags show you which way the joints are facing. And we want the x-axis to point down the length of the bone, so you can see that this knee points down the bone. That's good. This one points down the bone. That one's good. But this one points up the bone, and this one points up the bone. So that's not good. That's rotated the wrong way. This one on the spine points down the bone. That's good. Now you might be confused because I'm saying up and down. Down the bone is from the big end to the little end. That's down. Okay. Up the bone would be from the little end to the big end. Okay. So that's how I'm orienting it. So the joint is facing down from the big end to the little end. So this one, see how the little X here is pointing toward the big end, that means it's pointing up the chain. This one's pointing toward the little end, so that's pointing down the chain. So we want the X to point down the chain. Down the chain, that's going up the chain, that's going down the chain. Okay? And I also want my Z to be front. Okay? So to do that, I'm going to go over to my Orient options. Again, make sure you have all your joints selected. So I'm going to go to Select, make sure all by type joints, get them all good. And X is my primary axis, so that's the one that's going to go down the bone. And then my secondary axis, the one that I want to be pointing forward, is going to be my Z. And then I'm going to orient my secondary axis in the positive direction. That way it rotates forward positive. If you wanted to rotate forward on a negative, you could switch it. It's up to you. But generally positive is what you want. And then I'm going to choose Orient Children and Reorient Local Scales and hit Apply. And you'll see when I do that, all of my joints now align. So Z is forward, X is going down the length. Z is forward, X is going down the length. And you want to make sure that your joints point straight on forward. If you had a situation, I'm going to go ahead and mess this up on purpose. If you had a situation where they were kinked sideways, then you would want to try a different orientation, or you'd have to rotate these manually, which is tedious, but you can do it. But I'm going to go and get my secondary axis there and make sure I'm X, Z, Z. Hit Apply. That way they are, of course, pointing straight down the plane there. Pelvis, Z is forward, X is down the length. That's good there. Shoulder, Z is forward, X is down the length. Shoulder, Z is forward, X is down the length. And those are all good. The only ones that are messed up are the, go ahead and close this, are the end joints. The end joints don't generally get a lot of influence. Most of the time, we just make these so that we have a bone there. But Maya actually doesn't care much about the bones. It only cares about the joints. So what we're going to do, we actually really don't need these end joints for a lot of this. But in my case, since I have them there, I'm going to rotate this so it matches my skeleton. To do that, we have to do it manually because the ones at the end get kind of wonky. So what we're going to do is come up to right here in between window and skeleton. And you can see you have this little arrow that points at these boxes. So this is like object mode, and then these are component modes. So right here we have these 4 little boxes and the arrow. This is a component mode. Go ahead and click on that. And you'll see that our joint turns blue. That means it's selected in component mode. And then right next to component mode, there's this little tab bar. See that? It's real thin. If you hit that, it'll open up. And we have this little question mark. If we hit the question mark, that's going to allow us to actually select this axis here. So if you click on the little widget in the middle, you can see how that highlights. And we can actually rotate that. If I hit the rotation tool and I go to rotate this, you can see I can manually change the axis itself. And I want the X to point down the length of the bone, and I want Z to be forward. So to do that, oops, I didn't mean to do that. To do that, I'm going to hold down the J key, and that's going to snap my rotation, and I want to just make sure that that's rotated straight up. Okay, and that's one way to do this. And now if you ever need to know how to rotate a joint by itself, you can. But another way to, because again these end joints are a little bit wonky. They don't like to, the way Maya works is it can only orient this when it's facing down a bone for whatever reason. It's always been that way for a long time. But another quick way of orienting this thing, if you don't want to do it manually, go ahead and open up the attributes, scroll down, and go down towards this joint, and then in joint, scroll down to joint orient, and just go ahead and set these to 0. And that should orient it to the parent joint, and you can see that that points the Z forward and the X up, which is what we want. I'm going to go ahead and do that for the hand joints and the feet joints. I'm going to come down and grab my hand joint. Go ahead and select that. And just make sure that when you do, you can see that my joint didn't change here. I selected this joint, but it didn't change. I'll go ahead and grab that axis. And then, so I have left wrist, that's the correct one. And then my orient, you can see under joint, joint orient, that it's slightly off in the Z. So I'll go ahead and orient Z. And you probably can't notice it visually by any change, but it is pointing forward, and then Y is up, Z is out. And I'll go to the other side. And on this side, you can see that X, of course, is going down the length, Z is going forward, and Y, because it's flipped, it's going down, which is fine. I'm going to grab, oops. That's the trouble with being in component mode and trying to grab a joint, is it's a bit wonky. Let's see if I can grab that one. Where are you? And then get that axis. And in here, you can see that the joint orient, that one is off, so 0, and I'll 0 that one out. And so now X is forward, Z is out, so that's good. And grab these feet joints, that axis. I'll go ahead and 0 that. Again, just make sure that when you're grabbing it that you're checking, so that's the right foot, which it is. And you can see when I put that in, it does orient. Alright, and once again, I'm going to go ahead and grab that last one. Grab the axis. And that one's kind of really off there, so go ahead and 0 that out. Just make sure you do have the correct label. So this is left foot, left foot. Okay. It should be good enough for government work. So lastly, I'm going to get out of this component mode. I'm going to come up to the top here. I'm going to uncheck that checkbox. And I will hit this little bar to collapse that back down. I'll go back into object mode. And let's reselect all of our joints. So I'm going to go up to select all by type, joints. I'm going to bring up skeleton, orient joints, open that up. And then I'm going to click toggle local axis visibility to turn the axes off, because everything else looks like they're pretty good. So there's our skeleton, there's our skin. And then the last thing to do before closing out the video is going to be binding the skeleton to the skin. So go ahead and select your skeleton at the root there, so at the pelvis. Hold shift and select the skin. I'm going to bring up my textured view by pressing 6. And if you can't see your joints in textured view, just go ahead and go up to shading and then come down and make sure you have X-ray joints on. I don't remember if we turned that on in the beginning or not, but I usually have it on, so just go ahead and check that, make sure it is, and then you'll be able to see your joints when it's shaded. Okay, so when these two are selected, let's go ahead and go up to our skin tab. If you don't see skin, make sure you're in rigging, and then open up the bind option. So bind options. Make sure that we have bind to is set to joint hierarchy, so we'll get all the bones. And then binding method, you can do whichever method you prefer, but I generally prefer geodesic voxel because it gives us a very precise calculation. Closest and distance isn't bad, but I get better results out of geodesic voxel. Skinning method and these last three here, these are default. Those are pretty good. I haven't had any issues with any of these messing up, so those are fine. Let's see. Max influences, I'm going to set to 5. And most bipedal mesh models, 5 to 7 influences is pretty good, actually. It depends on who you ask. Some people swear by having lower influences, but my experience has been between 5 to 7 works pretty well. And then it's going to be up to you if you want to maintain max influences or not. General experience on my end, like I haven't had an issue really either way, but I generally just turn that off. And then I'm going to hit apply. Once you apply it, it should skin it. I can go ahead and close this box, and we should be able to, and you'll see your skeleton changes color because these are all labeled based on skin cluster. And I'm going to go ahead and select the joint and just try rotating it. We should be able to bend the mesh. Look at that. So I can wiggle his arm, I can move his leg, I can even bend the knee. Turn the head. Okay, so that's going to do it for this video. In the next tutorial, I'll show you how to skin weight, and then we'll do some animations. All right. Make sure you save your work, and if you like this video, hit the like button, comment, subscribe. Usual kind of suspects. And if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to leave them in the comments. And I will see you in the next video.